everybody. Thanks so much for coming for day 7, which is Oceans Day. I know so many of us are excited for Oceans Day. Thanks to our friends at Blue Marine Foundation for making today possible. So we'll be talking about conservation, restoration, and preservation. And no better way to start than to hear from two amazing young women, Francesca Trotman and Madelaine St. Clair. And we have a session moderated by the fabulous Wondering World Ambassador, Mavis Mainu. So please welcome them up to the stage with a huge round of applause.
Good morning. I love the excitement. We are going to have a really good day today talking about oceans conservation. My name is Mavis Mainu, and I'm the director for Oak Foundation. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce our amazing keynote speakers for today's event. Our first keynote speaker is Madelaine St. Clair. We will begin our first session today by hearing from Madelaine. Madelaine is an early career tropical marine biologist, wildlife photographer, and conservation filmmaker. Today, she'll be taking us on a journey of climate change through her eyes. Madelaine, please have the stage. Shall we give her a round of applause?
Is it on? Yeah. Thank you very much for that very warm introduction. So yeah, I'm excited today to take you on a little bit of a journey through climate change in the world as I've seen it. But you know, before we get into that, I want to start this talk today by talking in the traditional way that us Brits would strike up a conversation. 1 second, sorry, I'm having a little bit of a technical issue here. So yeah, as I said, I wanted to start this talk today as us Brits would typically start a conversation, and that is by asking you to think about the weather. Now, before you get lost in thought about how it rains for nearly 3/4 of the year here in Scotland, and it does, as many of us will know from the weather yesterday, what I actually want you to think about is what we call a weather anomaly, where the weather did something a little out of the ordinary. Something a little unseasonal, perhaps, something that is out of the bounds of what we would normally expect for that time of the year or for that location. For example, were you affected by the flooding on the tubes in August? Did you start barbecuing in spring last year when the temperatures hit a record 38.7-degree high in May? Or like me, were you here in the Scottish Highlands this September for the warmest September day since 1906. And now I want you to think, did these events make you feel anything? Did they make you emotional? Because truthfully, for many of us here in the UK, aside from being a minor disruption to our day and a major weather-related talking point that we can enjoy over a cup of tea, these things don't tend to affect us too much from our daily lives. Now me, I get emotional about the climate. Some say too emotional, and you know, in complete honesty, when I was writing this talk today, I found it a little bit difficult to strike a balance between climate grief, a call to action, and hope. And today I kind of want to show you why. Because I'm not here today to talk about all of the weather anomalies that we have here in the UK, because we've experienced a lot, it's true. But despite these hot days, heat waves, wetter summers, earlier springs, or milder winters, these things pale in comparison with many of the impacts of climate change that I've seen in remote ecosystems around the world. Six years ago, I was on my way to Cuba, where I was about to do my first ever expedition on a coral reef. I was 19, enthusiastically studying for my degree in biological sciences, and I was totally and utterly in love with an ecosystem that I'd never actually been to. So I arrived here in Cuba, the ecological crown jewel of the Caribbean Sea, which is what they called it. And when I finally took that first magical breath underwater, I was disappointed, because it didn't quite look like the textbooks I'd seen or the documentaries I'd seen or the pictures on Instagram, because the coral was patchy, degraded, and in some places dead and gone. And here I am on that very first expedition doing my first ever coral reef transect. It's a very simple concept, actually. You lay out a tape measure between 2 points on a reef, and then you swim along the tape measure and you count coral, sponge, rock, algae, etc., etc. So this was my first time on a coral reef and my first time doing this kind of science, and telling the difference between a rock, an algae, a sponge, and a piece of coral was still a little bit difficult. So when I came up from my first few dives and realized that I'd recorded mainly algal cover on my transect, I naturally thought this was my error. And I'll never forget that moment when I came up from these first few dives and I spoke to the professor and I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "No, the error is not yours. What we're actually seeing here is a phase shift. The transition from a reef that once was dominated by coral to one, as you can see here, that is dominated by algae." Now, I was crushed because this was my very first insight into how climate change, alongside other stresses in this region, for example, tourism, overfishing, land-based pollution, an invasive fish species, and a mass urchin die-off, but how all these things were working together to affect our coral reef ecosystems. But perhaps more poignantly, this was not to be my only experience of climate change on this trip, because my first ever coral reef experience was to coincide with one of the most extraordinary marine heat waves on record, one that would go on to wreak havoc on ecosystems across the world. The 2015-16 El Niño bleaching event. Now, some of you might not be familiar with this natural phenomenon, but the El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO for short, is a fluctuation of the global climate system, and it's caused by air-sea interactions in the tropical Pacific. Now, ENSO is characterized by two parts, as you can see here. El Niño, which is the warming of abnormally warm sea surface temperatures, and La Niña, which is abnormally cool, sea surface temperatures. Now, the effect of this, we have impacts on weather, fisheries, ecosystems, and these effects are felt worldwide. Now, I'm a scientist, so I couldn't resist throwing in a graph or two, and here we have a wonderful long-term data set from NOAA, which allows us to track this phenomenon over time. And this data set here that we're looking at actually dates back to the mid-19th century, and as you can see, though these events are slightly irregular, they do tend to occur every 3 to 6 years, and they vary in their intensity. But now if we hone in on the last 50 years in particular, what you can see is that there are 3 warming events, El Niño events, that stand out in particular above that red line with the 2 there. 1983, 1997, and 2015. And the result? Mass coral bleaching events. So when I arrived in Cuba back in 2015, I was in the middle of the 2015 peak of that El Niño event, and it was exceptionally warm and dry. Jumping into the ocean was like jumping into the bath, and the temperature stayed pretty consistently above 31 to 32 degrees Celsius for the entirety of my stay. But what I didn't realize at the time was that I was about to begin my career in the wake of this hugely powerful ocean warming event, one of the strongest in the last 50 years. Because at this time, on the other side of the world, the El Niño was really getting started, and it was being felt by our reefs, with areas of the tropical Pacific experiencing temperature increases above the usual of about 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius. Now, to many of you, this may not seem like much. I know 2.5 to 3 degrees, but to a coral, this presents a real problem. Because reef-building corals are fussy things. They generally require sunlight, clear, unpolluted water, require a certain salinity, and much like us Brits on a summer holiday, like it warm, but not too warm. So most corals have an optimum temperature threshold of around 27 to 31 degrees Celsius, and beyond this, reefs will actually start to experience a decrease in growth, reproduction, metabolism, and productivity of calcium carbonate, which is what they use to build the actual reef structures. And a prolonged spike of just 1 to 2 degrees can lead to coral bleaching. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but bleaching is this process whereby corals, the animal, expel the colorful symbiotic algae from their tissues, which leaves behind the transparent flesh of the coral on top of the white calcium carbonate skeleton. Hence the name bleached, because it's white. Now, corals can actually stay in this bleached state for a week or two, but if the temperatures stay consistently high and they cannot reabsorb the algae there to provide with food that is photosynthesized, the coral reefs will eventually starve and die, reducing reefs that once looked like this to this. Now back to my journey as a marine scientist. So by this point, it had actually taken me from the Caribbean to the Indo-Pacific, where along the way, I completed my master's in tropical marine biology and conducted research, filmed and photographed these reefs and their ecosystems along the way. By this point, I'd seen a lot more of these species, these ecosystems, the way they all interacted together, but most poignantly of all, I saw that the hands of anthropogenic activity were everywhere. In Lombok, I watched tourists trampling coral. In Borneo, I saw reefs littered with plastic, more plastic than I'd ever seen. In Wakatobi, where I did my master's in bioacoustics and took sound recordings of the reef, its poor health was reflected in how quiet it was. And in Sulawesi, I felt the blasts of dynamite bombs ripping through me as fishermen over a kilometer away were using a method of destructive fishing which literally obliterates the reef. But none was quite so bad, it's a video, as the Maldives. It doesn't look too bad, right? Well, I was here as a research intern for Manta Trust, and we were studying the largest known aggregation of manta rays in the world. And, you know, whilst the manta rays were incredible, and I mean truly, truly incredible, one of the things that I have been most excited for about coming to the Maldives was the coral. But when I got there, the reefs looked like this, and this, and this. Don't worry, it's dead. I would never sit on live coral. Because unlike Cuba, where the reefs were shifting from coral to algal, this was something entirely different. This felt like the aftermath. It was no longer an ecosystem in transition. Now, this is a great graph here, this figure, because it shows just how badly, in numbers, the coral reefs were effective in the Maldives. And this is to do with the shallow coral, the reef-building coral in the Maldives. And if you look at this, you can see in purple, we have the live coral cover, and in orange, recently dead coral. And two peaks stand out. And what does this show? It shows that the mass bleaching events coincide with the two El Niño events of 1998 and 2015. But, you know, you look at this graph again, and there's something else that you can see that is more critical, perhaps. And that is that it took over 15 years to recover the same level of live coral as before the bleaching event. And seeing as how climate change is increasing not only the intensity of these marine heat waves, these El Niños, but also the frequency, it shows that our reefs in the future will have less and less time to bounce back. Now, it's not to say there isn't hope, though, because there is. I know because I've seen it. The pristine, the healthy, The coral that stretches unbroken against an underwater horizon. The coral that has 100 different textures. It's vibrant with color. It's loud with life. Ecosystems that are reminiscent of a bustling city when others across the world have been reduced to less than hamlets. And in a few small corners of the world, it's a video. Pockets of pristine coral and areas with some resilience to climate change do exist and may provide a refuge for the reefs of the future. And though this smacks of hope, every time I take a breath on one of these reefs, I am struck by the possibility that our reefs will look very, very different in the future. Now, I'm going to change tack a little bit slightly and fast forward past 18 months of Zoom and wine and pajamas and sometimes all three at the same time to this August when I found myself diving not in a bikini but in a dry suit, flying drones over glaciers, dodging icebergs in rough waters with a team of incredible women on board this boat here, Clair. So, a few weeks prior to this photo being taken, I had received a call from documentary filmmaker Sophia Scott, who had asked me to join a project out in Greenland to document climate change and plastic pollution in the Arctic. Now, as a tropical marine biologist, I was a little out of my comfort zone, as the polar ecosystems, though not totally new to me, are, a little out of my scope. But these are the things that I do know. The Arctic and the Antarctic differ in a number of ways. One is in the north and one is in the south. One has bears and one has no bears. And one is a landmass surrounded by ocean, and the Arctic is an ocean surrounded by land. And within this ocean sits Greenland, a not-so-tiny island that is 2/3 the size of Australia, covered by an ice sheet the size of Mexico, and in some places is 2 miles thick with ice. Now, for an ecosystem that is so different to the one that I know and love, the parallels were everywhere. The almost tropical blue hues of the fjord water, the remoteness, a video again, sorry. The remoteness, the lack of people, and the stunning, stunning wilderness. But the strangest thing for me, especially having studied bioacoustics, was that it even sounds like coral reefs. Now, any person who has snorkeled on a reef will know that the living biota makes these snaps, crackles, and pops, and glacial ice makes a noise that is very much the same as 1,000-year-old compressed air escapes in tiny bubbles. But, perhaps most similarly of all, this ecosystem, like my beloved coral reefs, is an ecosystem in transition. Now, climate change is amplifying not only the thawing of permafrost, but increasing the loss of seasonal snow cover. It's increasing the loss of summer sea ice, and it is speeding up the melting of glaciers and ice sheets. In the summer months, this glacier carves around 200,000 tons of ice a day into the fjord. In Greenland as a whole, that's 1 million tons a minute and around 280 billion tons per year. In fact, the entirety of Greenland contains enough fresh water locked up in ice in order to raise the sea levels by 7 meters, which doesn't feel like much perhaps until you are standing on an island, much like I was in the Maldives a couple of years before, that sits less than 1 meter out of the water. Now, the Arctic has been warming at twice the rate of the rest of the planet in the last half a century, and it is expected to continue to warm faster than the rest of the globe. And like the tropics, Greenland isn't immune to its own devastating set of weather events. Extreme heat events have increased here since the 70s, and minimum temperatures have increased at 3 times the global rate. Now, back in 2012, rain fell on the Greenland ice cap for the first time, and when we were out there filming, we experienced another weather anomaly as temperatures soared once more. Warm air was carried up over Greenland and held there, which for us meant shorts and t-shirts, and for the ice cap meant one of the most widespread, large-scale melting events that we have only seen happen on 3 other years in the last century. And when I say the last century, what I mean is all 3 of these years actually occurred since the 90s. When we were out there this year, rain was reported on the highest peak of the Greenland ice cap for the first time. And, you know, rain was so unexpected here that the team at the site didn't even have the correct gauges to measure the rainfall. And then there are parts of Greenland that don't look like they belong in the Arctic or the subarctic at all. Parts of the fjord that have been long since uncovered by ice, the glaciers long since retreated. And here we can see on a sunny day, the river input. There's actually a glacier way back over here, if you imagine. This is the glacial sediment coming into the fjord, giving the illusions of underwater waterfalls. So when I put my drone up and I saw beauty like this, sometimes it's hard to decide if the theme is loss or if the theme is merely transition. Now, history tells us that it is transition as dinosaurs became birds and ice ages came and went and came again. The earth shapeshifts, it reforms, it recreates. But to me, these things become loss when they happen within a single lifetime. And the loss of the 2 ecosystems that I have spoken about today isn't just an ecological crisis, it's a humanitarian one too. Because globally, more than 500 million people depend on these reefs for food, livelihood, and coastal protection. Sea level rise will displace a further 410 million. Now, Greta argued that we were stripped of our childhood. But I have to ask myself, if we were so stripped of ours, then what skeletal remains will be left for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren? Will they see a coral reef? Will they see a glacier, a rainforest? Because the science says they won't, and my eyes say they won't. Now, as a woman, I get told a lot that I am too emotional about the climate crisis, but how can I not be emotional when we are living in a time of willful ignorance? And yes, sometimes it's hard to connect with the natural world, especially in a city like Glasgow, where though climate change can be felt and sometimes even amplified in heat waves, sometimes the greatest ecosystem changes really do feel like a lifetime away. But I speak now, and when I speak to the leaders of our nations, because when you take emotion away, we still have numbers. Numbers that show that our planet is warming, that our climate is destabilizing, that our wildlife and biodiversity is declining, and that millions will be displaced and hungry, without food, without livelihood. And our numbers also show where we should be directing our efforts. Because we live in a society where 70% of emissions have been produced by just 100 companies, where 20 firms are responsible for over half of plastic waste, where leading nations ask the UN to downplay the role of fossil fuels in the carbon climate crisis. In a world where one billionaire had to take a 4-minute joyride in space just to come to a climate change conference to lecture us all on how he had now seen the fragility of Earth. Because we are past consumer blame. We are past empty pledges, and we are past allowing the science to fall on deaf ears. So no, I won't apologize for my emotion, because if we don't acknowledge the harrowing reality of the point that we are at, then we will never be able to make the changes that are necessary for the future. Thank you.
Oops. I don't know how you're feeling. I don't know how you're feeling, but this was a lot to process. And it's really sad to see the impact of our activities on the oceans. Thank you so much, Madelaine, for sharing your journey with us. We are leaving here with a lot of learnings, and I'm pretty sure, even for me, I'm going to be an ambassador for ocean conservation after this event. So thank you so much, Madelaine. This was really inspiring. Now we'll have the pleasure to listen to our second keynote speaker, Francesca Trotman. Francesca is the managing director and founder of Love the Oceans. Francesca will explore the human side of conservation, her own experience in the field, and the tasks ahead to conserve our planet ocean. Shall we once again give Francesca a round of applause as she also shares her journey with us?
Thank you for coming to my talk today. My name is Francesca Trotman, and as Mavis said, I'm the managing director and founder of an organisation called Love the Oceans. We are a marine conservation organisation, and we work in Mozambique, and we're working to establish a locally led marine protected area. I don't know about you, but I grew up with adverts on the TV showing Africa and telling me that I could provide a family with safe drinking water, healthcare treatment, a mosquito net or education for just £3. It was a guilt trip, and it worked. And I gave money to these large charities over the years without truly knowing where my money was going. The reality is that millions of people have given millions of pounds to these big organisations without really knowing how their money's spent. And that action is often not translated on the ground. One of the reasons for this is big charities not understanding the needs of the people that they're serving. This is largely due to organisations not listening to their communities and imposing assumptions of, for example, Africa on them. International NGOs feel the need to provide solutions instead of listening to those who already live there and have the solutions and empowering them to carry them out. This is modern colonialism. Foreign people going to a foreign country and assuming that they know best. Colonialism wasn't good the first time round. Why would it be any different now? The long-standing rhetoric of Africa in Western countries paints the entire continent with the same brush that you see Western travellers going to Africa daily and making assumptions about the people and communities they meet. These assumptions can be really damaging. A friend of mine came across a Western NGO while working in Africa that was building wells. They had found this community where women walked for 8 hours a day to get water. So, not speaking to the community, they assumed that by building wells close to the women's houses, they would free up the women's time and the women would have more time to do other activities. What they didn't realise is that these women were living in a society that oppressed them, and the only time they had away from their husbands was when they were walking for water. It was a crucial time for women to discuss community issues and solve problems. Whilst the NGO had good intentions just aren't good enough if you're actively doing damage. Grassroots organisations offer a bottom-up approach to NGO work. And in this talk, I'm going to focus on marine conservation, as that's my profession. But holistic strategies need to be applied to all charity work. Grassroots conservation organisations like my own NGO engage in community conservation, which is working in partnership with communities, listening to solutions and empowering them to achieve their goals. Why involve people in conservation? Well, people are usually the cause of the environmental problem, so they need to be involved in the solutions. This kind of conservation work is more time-consuming and complex, as it involves many more stakeholders and beneficiaries than an approach like fortress conservation, which displaces local people in favour of protecting the environment, disregarding the social issues that this causes. Whilst community conservation is time-consuming and complex, and the ecosystem can take longer to recover, as people are still using its resources, the solutions reached are often more long-term and benefit both local communities as well as the environment. So how does community conservation work? It's a step-by-step process. Identify the problem that needs to be resolved for the benefit of the environment. That's usually done by speaking to communities and sometimes using science to understand more of what is happening. Then it's a question of understanding why this problem exists. What's caused it? Are there numerous factors leading to this problem? What barriers have stood in people's way of solving it so far? When you've found the answers to these questions, that's your starting point. To visually demonstrate the complexities of these issues, I've got a couple of flowcharts to show you. The main question we always need to be asking ourselves as conservationists is why? So we've identified the problem in our area. Marine conservation, the marine ecosystem is not as healthy as it should be. Why? People are fishing any way they can to feed their families and make money. Why? They are unaware of declining fish stocks. Why? Because there's a lack of data and a lack of knowledge around how to utilize data. Why? Because there's a lack of education in the area. Most people in our area leave school around the age of 14. There's an illiteracy rate of around 50% and 75% in women. People are also unaware of declining fish stocks because it's only fishermen that use the ocean. People in our area don't use the ocean for leisure and so aren't seeing what's happening in real time. Why aren't people using the ocean leisurely? Because they're scared of it. And why are they scared of it? Because it's a fear of the unknown. There's a lack of education around the ocean and a lack of education around how to swim. So there's lots of drownings, which adds to the fear of the ocean. You can imagine that if you couldn't swim and your friends couldn't swim, and every time anyone that you knew went into the ocean and they didn't come home, you probably wouldn't be inclined to protect it, would you? And why can no one swim? Because there's no qualified instructors, because there's a lack of education. Also, there's no locally owned tourism outlets, and most foreign-owned outlets aren't inclined to let local people use their pools to learn to swim when they could be letting tourists use them and make money. Why are there no locally owned tourism outlets? Because of poverty. Such high poverty rates in our area means people don't have money to invest in businesses and build their own, and often daily life is hand to mouth. And all these issues are further interlinked. A couple more times. And one more. Thanks. And all these issues are further interlinked. Why are people fishing any way they can to feed their families? Because they don't have any other option because of the poverty levels. Now, you can then use this flowchart to identify the causes of the problem. You identify it by looking at what issues have arrows going in, but no arrows going out. That's poverty and lack of education. Then, through talking with community members, you need to identify where else help could be useful. For us, that's lack of data. We have scientists in our team. And finding a safe space to learn to swim. So how do you tackle these issues? Love the Oceans raised money for a community pool, which we're in the process of building. This means a safe space for people to learn to swim and removing that fear of the ocean. We also started our Ocean Conservation Champion, our OCC program, a few years ago, which provides kids, once they progress to our advanced swimming lessons, the opportunity to do further qualifications, like swimming instructors, like Bento in this photo, one of our OCCs. They can also do English lessons and further qualifications, or they can learn to dive, like Mario in doing his PADI open water in this photo. A lot of these further qualifications are ecotourism based because with the creation of the marine protected area, the job creation is going to be within the marine ecotourism space. And more jobs equals less poverty, and less poverty equals better conservation. We also have an education program around this, sponsoring 2 of our OCCs to finish high school every year, and we're working with the schools in our area to improve teaching facilities and resources, all working to improve education, especially around marine conservation. We run community workshops on a range of conservation issues, all like sustainable fishing, turtle nesting, and marine resource management. And all of the data we collect leads back into those workshops. We also have an alternative livelihood section of the organisation, identifying possible alternative livelihoods to fishing, like agriculture, sustainable honey harvesting, and aquaculture, which would all supplement income and alleviate pressure on the ocean to provide both food and financial security. This, in turn, tackles poverty, which I mentioned in my earlier in this flowchart. And by tackling these root causes, you remove the problems in the flowchart, eventually solving your original issue, largely through social issues. This is why involving communities in conservation work is so important. These issues are just so complex. And when you think about your strategy, you also have to think about your stakeholders. As I mentioned, in community conservation, you have a lot of stakeholders. In our area, 53% of our population are women. But there are no women involved in the marine space. Why is that a problem? Well, to create an efficient conservation strategy and an effective one, you need all your stakeholders to have a seat at the table. Let's take a bit of a closer look at that. There are no women involved in marine conservation. Why? No women can swim. Why? Well, there are a few reasons. First, they don't have access to menstrual products compatible with swimming. There are also no female role models that swim in our area, and swimming is seen as a less essential skill for girls, which is a rhetoric perpetuated by the fact that there are no swimming women role models. Why don't women have menstrual products compatible with swimming? Because the products simply aren't available in our area. We're fairly rural and remote, so things like cups and tampons are difficult to get. Swimming is seen as a less essential tool for girls because traditionally women look after house and farm. This is because they're less qualified than their male counterparts. Why? Because they're dropping out of school early. Why is that? Because they're having children and getting married very young. In our community, having sex out of wedlock isn't taboo, but getting pregnant is. So women are having sex young, with little education around contraception and no access to it, getting pregnant and having to get married and drop out of school. So when we identify the root causes, we identify these three: lack of availability of menstrual products, lack of education around contraception and periods, and lack of access to contraception. So how do you tackle these issues? We've recently launched our Women's Health Project, headed by this amazing woman, Edna Galumba. The project is working to identify the most useful and desired menstrual products, enabling women to manage their periods easier, with the potential for creating women-led micro-businesses along the way in the making of these products, also tackling poverty, mentioned in my previous flowchart. We'll also be partnering with health organisations and government to increase access to contraception and deliver educational workshops around menstrual health and sexual health. And once again, when you tackle these root causes, the other issues fall away, enabling you to overcome the initial problem through addressing different social problems and involving women in the solution. This is Melta Marangula, our first female OCC enjoying her swimming lessons. And when you think about your conservation strategy, you've also got to think about the long-term change that everybody wants to see and how that will be maintained. You've seen how complex these issues are, and that is why community-led projects are so essential. With Love the Oceans, we envisage eventually being able to step completely away from the management of the marine protected area, as it will all be locally led. Self-sustaining projects like this are better for the environment in the long run, and often more financially manageable, with grassroots organisations working on shoestring budgets and complete transparency in their work. We think and we hope that more organisations are waking up to this grassroots, community-led way of operating and change their approach to conservation for the good of the environment. To do this, it is essential to listen to communities, empowering them to make changes and involving people in conservation. As we always say at Love the Oceans, teamwork makes the dream work. Thank you for listening.
Another wonderful speech. Thank you so much, Francesca. And I want to highlight one thing that you said at the beginning, which is one of the challenges of development cooperation when it comes to Africa. When we have a lot of Western organizations thinking they know the solutions and they don't involve the people in the community to co-create these solutions. So I'm really impressed that you're involving the community people and you're co-creating these solutions together. So thank you for the amazing work you're doing.
Just to add to that, sorry, Pascal Numasua, our community outreach manager, actually helped write that speech, and he's watching now, so I just wanted to say
Thank you. And yes, we will take 1 minute to appreciate our virtual audience. So hello, thank you for joining us online. So we are going to move to the question and answer session. First, we would have, because they have so much knowledge, we want to still learn a bit more from them. So we are going to have a conversation with our panel, and then would open it up to the audience depending on how much time we have. And so for those of you listening to us online, please also put in your questions. There will be the opportunity also to get to those. And I also want to use this moment to appreciate the all-female panel, which is normally not the norm. So I really want to
cheers to that.
Acknowledge that. Great. Thank you. So I'll begin with you, Madelaine, since you were the first to go, so I hope it's okay. The climate crisis has meant rising sea temperatures and increased ocean acidification. Can you tell us more what the impact of this has been on the marine life? I mean, you already shared a lot of insights with us, but could you tell us a bit more of that?
Yeah, sure. So there are a number of different ways that the climate crisis is impacting species across the world, and I'm not going to go into all of them now because it's too enumerate, but the bottom line is that climate change is affecting ecosystems, and that means that we will be seeing changes right across all of the trophic levels. So every level of the food web will be affected by rising sea temperatures, because we're not only going to see changes to habitat, but we also see changes to things like animal behavior. For example, I was talking about corals and how they have a minimum and a maximum general temperature threshold, well, the corals that I work with anyway. And corals are what we call site-attached species, so they physically can't move. They are, well, relatively stuck where they are. But we do have some species, like fish, for example, pelagic fish, which are open ocean fish, and when we have warmer temperatures, they also have an optimum temperature threshold that they will inhabit. So species that can migrate and can move, we are actually seeing what we call poleward range shifts at the moment. So lots of species are actually moving away from the tropics, north or south, to escape this band of warming water that is happening around the middle. So that's one way in which they're being affected. Another way is, I was talking about weather anomalies and things that are unseasonal. We're seeing things happening at the wrong time of the year, and this is going to have massive knock-on effects for not only animal behavior, but also the locations where we'll be finding animals, because will their feeding grounds be in different places? Will plankton blooms be happening at this time of the year because the waters are either too warm or too cool, which then has knock-on effects up the levels. And for me personally, when I was out in the Arctic this year, one of the craziest things, one of the stories that we heard from the local population was that they hadn't seen a single seal in one of the areas in Western Greenland where we were the entire season. And now, Greenland has a large proportion of their population that are indigenous, Inuit, and hunting is still, subsistent hunting is still a very, very big part of their culture, and part of this is hunting seals. And, you know, they said that it was incredibly concerning for them not to see these seals, and we said, do you know why? And they said, well, the weather's changing. This year it's been extraordinarily warm, and are the fish moving? Why are the fish moving? What is causing the fish to move? You know, there are so many different layers, and yeah, the bottom line is ecosystems are changing, temperatures are changing, and we don't know what's going to happen where and when in the future.
And I think just adding to that, Mads mentioned coral reefs quite a bit in her talk, and I think just relating that back to kind of your everyday living, and even if you live in a city, how it affects you. I think a lot of people don't realize that coral reefs are such an essential nursery ground as well. So a lot of the commercially important species that you eat in your day-to-day life, like every week kind of thing, all of the young grow up in coral reefs. So whilst, yes, it's sad if like aesthetically the coral reefs are not there anymore, but in terms of food security, has a massive impact for commercially important species, as well as obviously like artisanal and everyone who relies on it on a day-to-day basis, subsistence fishermen, like in our area, but on like a global scale, commercially important species, coral reefs dying off is a massive food security problem.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it's 25% of all fish life in the ocean depends on a coral reef at one stage of their life cycle. So that is a huge proportion, and it will have massive implications for our future food security, not just locally, but across the world.
And to add to that, I think a few months ago, the World Heritage Committee was actually considering putting the coral reef as one of the World Heritage sites in danger. So they are really in danger, although the decision was backtracked, so they are no longer on the list for some reasons that cannot be said online. But yeah, so the coral reefs are really in danger, and I think that we really need to do something because our life and our survival, it's at stake. So we'll just move on to the second question, and maybe I start with you, Francesca. So we are meeting here in the context of COP26. Oceans undoubtedly must play a significant role in the fight against climate change. So what more needs to be done to ensure that international agreements that focus on ocean conservation are effective and adhered to? We've seen a lot of announcements this time at COP, and we do know that usually it's not followed through. So the action part, it's not really effective. So what should we do to make sure that these agreements are adhered to?
Well, we were discussing this earlier, actually. I think we're all fed up of promises being made and then absolutely nothing happening, and no changes actually happening. We both actually immediately thought of completely different points, which is quite interesting. So my first thought was accountability. There needs to be some kind of accountability when promises aren't met. There needs to be some kind of penalty for not meeting those. And whilst that can be extremely complex, I think that still needs to be looked at and put in place, because otherwise it's just empty promises, and with no consequences for any country that isn't meeting their goals, especially like we all know the Western countries like the UK and the US are some of the biggest, well, the biggest contributors to this global problem, then there needs to be some kind of consequence to just not doing essentially their job as world leaders. So for me, it was accountability. You said financial.
Yeah, so I said two things. I said financial, but underneath that is enforcement, because one of the problems that we have is with the ocean in particular is that we designate a lot of marine protected areas. And the greatest issue we have with these is how do you police them? And we've got this amazing pledge, again, another pledge from many nations across the world. It's a UK-led pledge called 30 by 30. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, which is to protect 30% of our oceans by 2030. Now, this is an incredibly ambitious target, considering that only 2% of our oceans, I think it's actually slightly less than that, are currently designated protected areas. But the problem I have with this pledge is that how do you police 30% of the ocean? Where will you find the money to police 30% of the ocean? Because it's very much like very well and good saying, let's designate this area here, which we have the research and the data to back up that, yes, we should be protecting it for the fact that it's a breeding ground, a nursing ground, a place where a specific species come that is essential for like our future food security or something. But aside from that, these animals don't stick to the constraints of an imaginary line that we draw in the water, and we don't really have the funding or the investment to actually see these things through without, using the nation's navies of the world. I can't see how we're going to do this. So for me, one of the biggest questions about how do we protect the ocean going forward, and what more do we need in addition to accountability, which we really do, because what's the point in making pledges and then 5 years later coming to another climate conference and saying, okay, let's just pledge more money, even though we didn't meet anywhere near the target last time. So yeah, we need funding, we need accountability, and we need enforcement. We need action.
Yeah, and also with like the whole 30-30 campaign, it's obviously very admirable and great and something to aspire to, but a lot of the areas that have been discussed to be designated are actually located in the high seas, and the high seas are literally hundreds of miles away from any land, and without any kind of international global army, like how is that going to be actually policed realistically? And like the reason that we use the model we use in Mozambique, a locally led model, is because you need communities involved in that conversation, and the stewardship needs to be the communities. And that's also the most financially feasible way of doing it, because realistically, when you establish a marine protected area, there's a lot of human resources invested in it as well, in terms of like security and guarding and rangers and all of that kind of stuff. So having a protected area managed by the local community is more efficient long-term financially, but it also takes a lot longer, and there is a lot of investment that goes in the first place in terms of skills building. So there's a lot of like different expertise, and the approach needs to be so holistic. It needs to be a completely different way of approaching management of protected areas. It can't just be, okay, well, this area is important, let's designate it an MPA, because just saying that an area is protected does not mean anything. Protection is only as good as the management in charge. And unfortunately, historically, that hasn't really gone that well, which is why we hope that things are becoming a bit more holistic and communities are more involved.
I think Greta says it best: no blah, blah, blah. We need accountability, we need the money and enforcement. Madelaine, I'll go to you next for the third question. So fishing has massively accelerated the decline in marine biodiversity and ecosystems. What steps need to be taken to ensure that these critical natural carbon secreting habitats survive?
So I'm actually going to pass this one to Chess, because she runs a sustainable fishing project, and I know that she will be able to chip in better than me.
So I work in usually subsistence fishing, so less kind of commercial space. But obviously there's been a lot of talk around commercial fisheries in the last year.
Seaspiracy.
And I think people have definitely become more aware of fishing and the problems that can be associated with it. Ending government subsidies is arguably the largest thing that can be done. And I think there definitely needs to be more kind of united action to end unsustainable fishing. I think we don't necessarily need to reduce our fish consumption. This is a very controversial view, but I work with people who live and rely on fisheries on a daily basis. So turning around to like 3 billion people on the planet that rely on fish as a primary protein source and saying, hey, you shouldn't eat fish anymore, is just not an option. So we don't really need to reduce our fish consumption. We need to change what fish we're consuming. Like if you think about what fish you eat and what fish you shop for in a supermarket, it's usually like salmon, cod, haddock, some kind of crustacean. I think there's one more, it's usually like the big five. And not really anything else. Like many people don't really eat many other fish in their entire lifetime. So the amount of pressure we're putting globally on those specific fisheries means that, yes, they are unsustainable and they are collapsing and we are going to run out those fish. But if we started diversifying our actual seafood consumption, and I'm not just talking like eating more mussels, I mean like eating less, quote unquote, less desirable species, but a much wider spread, you're spreading the pressure of food consumption over a lot of different populations. And there is such a thing as sustainable fishing, that I can categorically tell you that. I work in sustainable fishing. There is such a thing as sustainable fishing. But it needs to be monitored and managed. Again, management comes back to management. Effectively and efficiently, and there needs to be the laws in place to manage that as well. So there needs to be better commitments, accountability, and investment in. I know I'm preaching to the choir and repeating myself, but again, it's the same kind of story with fisheries, to make sure that all of the different habitats that are relied upon survive, especially through this tricky time.
Yeah, and just to add on that quickly, I think the problem with overfishing as well is that it isn't a standalone issue. And when we talk about large-scale industrial fishing, which is what they were talking about in Seaspiracy, we have to remember that these fish populations aren't just stressed by being overfished. They're being stressed by climate change, by pollution, by loss of habitat. You know, there are so many different factors going on here. And the thing about the large-scale industrial fishing that, from my perspective, in terms to stop ecosystem destruction and to deplete these populations further than they can recover, is that we need to stop funding overfishing. I mean, the governments across the world pour 16 billion dollars, of public money into supporting and propping up an industry that is fundamentally not turning a profit just to overfish and exploit populations of fish that don't need to be exploited. Now, it all comes back to that same thing again, reallocating funding. Where should we be placing this funding? We should be placing this funding into how to set up sustainable fishing projects, into carbon neutral projects. I mean, why are we funding oil and gas fields right now when we are at a climate change conference pledging X amount of money to stop climate change, you know? And it comes back down to looking at the numbers, reallocating the numbers and deciding to put our money as governments and nations, this is, because I feel like there is too much consumer blame that goes on. Governments, nations, big industry needs to put their money where their mouth is to start making change, because there's nothing left to say aside from that.
Great. I don't
Sorry,
know what
I'm passionate about this.
No, we are all passionate about this. Yeah, because I think most of the times that we hear, you know, you need to change your behavior, you need to do this, like, you know, putting the blame on individuals. But I think and when we do that, we sort of pushing the responsibility from the government and corporate, who are actually the ones responsible and need to take the action. So yeah, you're right in that sense.
It's the biggest distraction technique ever.
Yeah.
You know, don't look at us over here while we're fishing all the population. You over there, you shouldn't be eating that can of tuna. You are responsible for overfishing and killing all those dolphins and whales that we caught as bycatch, but don't worry about us.
I still have questions for you, but I think I want to give the opportunity to the audience to also ask some questions. So, digital audio, okay.
Thank you. So we've had some really interesting questions from our online audience. We have a question from Vietnam, and they're asking, how can I, as a young woman, get involved in ocean conservation outside of picking up plastic on our beaches?
Would you like to take this one? You start?
So look up your local NGOs and any government bodies that are getting involved in the marine space and going and working with them. A lot of stuff's virtual now because COVID, I mean, obviously it's been terrible, but like the one silver lining is that the virtual world has improved 1,000,000 times over. So there's often ways you can help out virtually if you can't get out, literally, if you don't live on like the sea and do that kind of work. But otherwise, I'd recommend reaching out to different NGOs. If there's an NGO, it can be international, it doesn't have to be local either. I mean, locally is great if you want to physically get involved and you can't afford to go abroad. But if you want to get involved virtually, you can look internationally for loads of different NGOs. And this goes for early career people in general, like making those connections is extremely useful. And you'll thank yourself later for building those connections early on. Most NGOs are massively understaffed and massively underpaid, so they are more than happy to have the help. So I would recommend reaching out and seeing what areas you can help in, especially think about your skill set and what your training's been in. If it's not directly marine biology, then I'd think about what your skill set is. Do you have a strong skill set in, like, the whole marine conservation world needs more people. It doesn't matter what your profession is, it needs more people. So if you're a lawyer, there's a whole section of maritime law that really, really needs your help. Accountants, social medias, influencers, like so many different professions that you might think are completely unrelated to marine conservation, but actually they are so needed that I would definitely recommend reaching out to an NGO and saying, hey, I have this skill set, I can offer you this, how can I get involved?
Also, just off the back of that, there is a really fantastic platform online called edX. So one thing I would recommend is if you want to get involved in conservation, a great way to do that is to also educate yourself more. And edX is a university-run platform. There are free courses on there on everything from tropical marine ecosystems through to how to process data, how to collect your own data, on Arctic climate change. I'm actually enrolled in a course that starts on Tuesday, which is about the polar ecosystems and climate change there. It's completely free. It's university standard, like lectures, and it's a really brilliant way to kind of develop your own knowledge further.
We've actually used that platform with Pascal, our community outreach manager, during COVID when everything was a bit more difficult to operate. Everyone was doing a lot more virtual stuff. So he was doing a lot of qualifications through edX. So
yeah, it's edX, edx.
That's just the name of the app.
Just
that I
edX.
downloaded.
Com. I think we can take one more question.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question because you said the coral reef ecosystems are disappearing at one place. Will they potentially move to other places and develop, and how long will it take?
Oh, this is such a great question. So, you know, there are some schools of thought that wonder if coral reefs, as we know them, so there are different coral reefs that you can find across the world. We do find corals, you know, deep water corals, and we do get corals in the Arctic and here in the UK, but they're very, very different to the ones, you know, that I study as a tropical marine scientist. Yeah, there is a chance that coral reefs could kind of move polewards like the fish very, very slowly. Because, I mean, they're not free swimming, really. I mean, they are kind of when they're in what we call the larval stage. But I don't know, personally. I can't answer that question on if it could happen or how long it could take. I mean, there is always a chance. But I think going forwards, what we have to focus on is areas that are areas of what we call refugia, which are basically areas that are already kind of resistant to climate change and have resilience. And there are reasons for this. For example, Indonesia. Indonesia is very interesting because they have a lot of cold water upwellings. So when there are El Niños, there are areas of some resilience because they actually have this cold water that kind of combats the sea surface temperatures that are higher than usual. And there are many places like this across the world where coral reefs will kind of have this extra level of protection because the natural way that the water moves or the temperatures are in that area. And those are the places where I believe we should be focusing our efforts for the coral reefs of the future, because we are past the numbers now. We are past the time of going back for many of the coral reefs across the world. And there are a lot of places where they actively do reef restoration by trying to, you know, increase the health of the reefs. And there is nothing wrong with this at all, but I ask, why are we pouring money into these places where the intensity and the frequency of these marine heat waves, as we saw, they're going to come back and the coral's just going to go slash and slash and slash until it can't recover fast enough. So in my opinion, we should be focusing our efforts on these areas where there is a refuge for corals of the future.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, I would love to still have this conversation. We have run out of time and we need to end our conversation. So thank you so much, Francesca, Madelaine, for sharing your knowledge, your experience, and your work with us. And thank you all for joining us today for the event, and our digital audience, thank you as well. So we can continue the conversation outside. It was a pleasure to have you, and I hope we can go out and become ambassadors for ocean conservation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Gosh, I think we're all very humbled, inspired. That was such an informative session to start the day. Please stick around, digital audience as well. Don't go. We have our next session starting at noon. Thanks so much for coming.